Let's go and get started, actually. I want to quickly just introduce Shruti. If you haven't heard of her or her company, Wingman, but she runs a company called Wingman, where she's the CEO and co-founder. And one of the things that I'm super excited to talk about is there's a lot of data out there, I think, on like what people are saying in sales calls and like all this other stuff. And what I really was excited to do when we started talking for the first time was this concept of like, how can we take like what feel like common best practices that you may have read in a sales book a long time ago, or that your sales coach or trainer, or that your sales manager maybe even told you, that is actually maybe incorrect or might be hurting your closing rate or hurting your ability to get a meeting on a cold call. And Shruti is going to share a little bit more about it here. But I mean, they literally have millions of minutes that they've looked at just in the last year of calls, tens of thousands of calls, and they're able to like kind of use data to pick out some of the patterns. And what I feel like they do a really tremendous job of at Wingman is like also taking a human element to that data too. I know we've had a lot of conversations, Shruti, about the data and like what you can and can't conclude from the numbers, but I'm super excited to have you on today.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, excited to be here. And, I think as we were prepping for this, there was a lot of back and forth where, you had some so-called best practices that you wanted to either validate or question.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's going to be fun. And of course, I mean, we kind of thought through some of the questions that people might have, and that's how we kind of came up with the data points. But would also be lovely to hear more questions from folks, and maybe we can do a follow-up at some point with some of the other questions with data answers.
No, absolutely. And just a quick reminder, if you haven't used Zoom before, I'm going to be fielding questions and kind of helping Shruti out here through the Q&A button. So you got a Q&A button right at the bottom of your Zoom screen there. Try to direct as much of the questions there as possible so that I don't miss them, so that we can bring them up. But we want to make this as tactical as possible. So she's going to be sharing some really cool stuff. And we're going to kind of pause and see what kind of questions people have. And we want to get to those. So make sure to use the Q&A function to ask the questions. And let's dig in. Take it away, Shruti.
Awesome. So yeah, like Jason said, we looked at nearly 250,000 calls and 2 million minutes of sales calls to come up with this. The inspiration was a few things. One of it was definitely things have changed rapidly with COVID. So we wanted to just also be cognizant of the fact that some of the data that we are seeing in the last 8 months or so might be somewhat different from what you might have seen last year. And so, just to understand how the landscape might be shifting. And yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that sales managers often struggle with, and I hear this, at least 25 times a day, is, I told them to do this, but they didn't do this, right? And and like when I think about it, it's like, if somebody came and told me, listen, if you drink more water, you will have less pimples. Just because you told me that doesn't mean that I believe you, right? Yeah. And I think that's kind of what happens in sales coaching as well. I think oftentimes salespeople don't change their habits because they don't necessarily believe that the so-called best practice is a best practice. And I think the other part of it, of course, is it's not easy to change those habits. I like to say that, being on a sales call is like a high stress situation. You have to be reactive. You can't kind of script and have everything prepped up. And so it takes a lot of conscious practice and effort to make even small changes sometimes. And and so I think it's important to know what are the changes that you should really look to make, and maybe what are the ones that you could queue for later part of the year next year.
Yeah, so it's an interesting management tool, it sounds like, and a leadership tool where you can kind of support the things that you're asking your team to do with like data, and you can find some of this across your team, which is cool. So yeah, I'm excited for this.
So, since I know that a lot of the audience, and since, it's blissful prospecting, a lot of the audience is, kind of in the early stages of that sales cycle when you're speaking to the customers. And one of the things that we wanted to look at was qualification questions, right? Because oftentimes you're expected to ask those. And what we see is that people don't ask qualification questions nearly as often as they should be. And there are, of course, some qualification questions that are more tricky that people maybe find harder to ask. And we just wanted to look at data on whether people are asking the questions and, which ones. So, we looked at overall sales calls, and we saw that in 10% of the calls, there is some form of a qualification question. And here we've only looked at, the BANT qualification, right? So it's questions related to either budget, authority, need, or timeline. I would say 10% is, is below par, right, from what people would have expected. And of course, this is across all of the different types of sales calls. So that some calls, are kind of past the qualification stage, so they're no longer relevant for asking qualification questions. But even then, like 10% is kind of low. And so we wanted to see, does it actually help people if they ask the qualification questions, right? And so we looked at the baseline of calls across all calls versus calls where people ask qualification questions. And then we see that there is, definitely calls with qualification have a 50% higher win rate, right? Jason, any quick thoughts on this? How would you react to this data point?
Well, so I'm thinking about like, why do only 10% of salespeople ask qualification questions? And then I think about, because I create a lot of content, a lot of the advice that you hear on LinkedIn is like, it almost makes salespeople feel bad for asking those qualification questions, where it's like, you're overqualifying the person, like prospects don't want to feel like you're qualifying them and like all this other stuff. But the data actually shows that you need to do some of that. And the people that do it have a much higher win rate. So I'm kind of wondering, like for everyone here in the chat, do you ask, like the very first time you talk to a prospect, either, that fit call, that discovery call, is there anything that you feel it keeps you from asking more qualification questions? Is it you feel uncomfortable with it? Like, let us know in the chat, is there anything that keeps you from asking more qualification questions to your prospects? I'm kind of curious to hear like what that is. So Ken says time. That's another thing I was thinking about too, Shruti, where it's like people feel like they maybe don't have enough time, and the prospect's like, well, just tell me, I just want to do a demo. What kind of stuff do you see that people, come across?
Yeah, so I think, if you want to dig deeper into what kind of qualification questions people do ask, even out of those 10% calls where people are asking questions, right, like a majority of them are around either timeline or budget, right? And what we see is questions related to maybe need, authority. Those are the ones that people really, really struggle to ask. And, part of it is definitely time, right? And I think one way to maybe handle that is to spread them out, right? So don't ask all of the qualification questions on your first call. You always have time to, maybe qualify on a subsequent call where there's a little bit more relationship and give and take. I think that's the other thing that managers sometimes don't do very well is split out the qualification questions across the playbook, right? So to say, let's go with these two and prioritize them, and then we'll ask some later. The other thing we see is sometimes qualification questions are not around just BANT, right? They're also around deal sizing. And those are the ones that people also struggle to ask because those are really about saying, am I going to give you a good account executive to speak to you, or am I going to put you on a self-serve flow? And then people are somewhat uncomfortable with those. And I've seen, one of the companies that we work with, they kind of, their sizing would literally depend on the revenue of the company. And it's not an easy question for an SDR to come out and ask that, say, can you tell me what is the revenue, right? It's a fairly sensitive piece of information. So I think there's also proxies that people need to find to get to the same answers. Like people might be more comfortable saying, hey, what is the size of your team? Or, something that is also helping you with sizing, but not directly related to a very sensitive piece of information.
Yeah, there's so much there. And I'm just looking at the comments and stuff too. It sounds like what I hear kind of overwhelmingly here is that like people feel like they don't want the prospect to feel like they're being interrogated. They feel like they don't have enough time. It's a lot of like, we feel like we're bugging the person. And I think that if you can kind of we got a lot of content, so we can't spend like too much time on this piece, but a way that you can kind of think of the questions, like to Shruti's point, is like, how can you ask these in a little bit more of an indirect way? So you don't have to say like, hey, thanks for taking my call today, Shruti. So what's your timeline for getting started with our training programs? What's your timeline for getting started with our software? Should you choose to move forward? Like, that's a really like very like specific, almost feel like invasive feeling question. You could ask that a little bit differently and say, hey, did you have like, any timeline in mind with like fixing this problem that you shared that you had? Or instead of the are you decision maker question, it's like, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about your team and who else like really cares, about this specific thing or this specific problem? So is that kind of where you're going, Shruti? Is like, if we can ask questions a little bit more like that, we can still kind of get, the need part of it. We can get the timeline part of it. We can kind of get an idea of the authority piece too, without like being super invasive, with our questioning.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is a lot of thought and empathy that needs to go into building those type of versions of the qualification question that, don't come across as a direct interrogation. Yeah, and I think a lot of teams, because they want to kind of keep it simple, they feel that they don't want to overscript things, and so they don't want to kind of define like the 3 other options for the qualification question. They kind of leave it up to the rep to define it. But if the rep doesn't put in the effort to, come up with those non-threatening conversational versions of the qualification questions, more often than not, they will not ask it.
Yeah. And Jess has a quick question here. I think that'll give context for everyone. These are like discovery calls and like demo calls that you took this data from?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
These are mixed discovery and demo. We have another section where we are only looking at like earlier stage calls.
Got it. Okay. And she was wondering, are these like customer support calls potentially or cold calls? We haven't gotten to the cold call stuff yet. So these are sales, discovery, or demo. Cool. Keep going, Shruti. Sorry.
Yeah, and so, of course, similar things we see for timeline questions, right? So one is people are definitely more comfortable asking timeline questions, and you also see a 51% increase in win rates if they are asked. And when you look at budget, it's, it's also asked about, but, the win rate is significantly higher here, right? So again, like, I think what we've seen is when people ask the budget question, it helps them preempt some of the roadblocks that they might encounter later and really plan that deal better, right? So I think this is a really important one that people are sometimes uncomfortable asking because they also feel that they don't want someone to kind of feel that, this is something too expensive or too unaffordable before they've even understood the value of it.
And a quick comment on the budget thing too is that, I don't know, I see so much conflicting advice on this too. I think it's important to talk about, like, I think a lot of companies, when they look into software solutions, actually do have a budget in mind. Now, it's completely different if you're selling something that's like huge enterprise, you're cold calling them, and the entire outreach has been cold, and you're catching them at a time where they're not thinking about this. But like a lot of people actually do have in mind, like, especially when I talk to them about coaching and training, they actually do have something in mind that they're looking to spend. And again, it's like, you could ask the question, Shruti, so what's your budget for a project like this? Or you could say, hey, I know we're talking for the first time here, and this might be kind of a weird question to ask at this point, but I'm curious because some people sometimes come into these calls and they have something in mind budget-wise. Did you have something at all that you wouldn't mind sharing? Like, it's a very different way of asking the question and accomplishing the same thing without them feeling like, do you have a budget? Yeah. What's your timeline? What do you feel is the need? Are you the decision maker? Like, and I'm being facetious when I do that, but I listen to a lot of these calls and that's exactly how they go. It does feel like an interrogation. So a lot of it's like your kind of style and how you preempt the question, that sort of stuff. But this is crazy. It's like, if we talk about budget, it impacts the closing rate like significantly if we can bring some of the stuff out. And it sounds like it'll help us get some of those objections out maybe a little earlier in the process so that it doesn't come down to this like big event at the end of the sales process where we're closing and then we figure out, all of this new stuff at the very end of the sales cycle.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that talking about budget early on does is, it pegs the way people are then evaluating the solution, because then through the sales cycle, they're pegging it to say, what, is this worth more than X amount for me, right? And Therefore, when the time comes to make the decision, they've already been making those micro decisions through that evaluation and sales process. And I think it just makes it easier for them because it's not new when they need to finally make that. The good news, of course, is that, sounds like COVID has gotten all of us to tighten the belt a little bit, and people are, reps are asking more about the budget qualification stuff this year than they were last year.
That's good.
So yeah, I think we kind of already went over it. I didn't present the data that we got from need and authority here because honestly, the numbers were really small. In the sense that very few percentage of calls people are asking those questions, and I think that's kind of the broader theme here, which is how do you, again, the kind of examples that you shared for budget and timeline questions, how do you preempt the need and authority questions again in the right frame?
And we'll send out like a recording of this to you guys afterwards too, if you want to kind of re-listen through that. But the need piece doesn't surprise me because that's connected to like the problem. And that's what I hear with discovery is like, that's kind of actually probably the most important element is that there's an actual need and some sort of problem that the person like acknowledges that they have, that they want to like entertain the idea of like potentially fixing, with you. So that doesn't surprise me at all.
Yeah. And I think again, need is something like sometimes people will do that basic need question, but then there is so much more to it. Like how do you kind of drill deep enough that you kind of discover the actual need? Because, customers are not going to come and tell you their deepest, darkest secrets, the first time you speak to them.
Yeah. Cool.
So yeah, I think somebody asked us about cold calls, right? And of course, very relevant for this discussion. So Jason, I think you had recommended that we dig into some data specifically around cold calls. There is so much controversy and there is always so much discussion on LinkedIn that I see around, this is what I use for cold calls, how pattern interrupt is important, how maybe taking permission is important, So yeah, it's definitely an intriguing topic. We can't churn the ocean on this one, so we just picked a few elements. One of those was, very often a response you get when you're on a cold call is, hey, sorry, we're already using someone for this, right? Or we are all set. And reps often don't know what that means or how to respond to it, right? And whether they should write off that deal, move on to the next one, or whether they should keep probing, right? So the first thing is that and so the way we looked at this cold call data was, we looked at only those initial calls that people have, right? And that could be maybe a little bit beyond the cold call as well, but not at the demo stage, right? And we looked at not just the close rate. In this, we looked at whether or not the deal progressed, right? So, for example, for a cold call, a success would be did a demo get set? Right, so that's kind of the context of the data here. It's a little bit different from the previous set that we saw. And so, the one thing that we see is, in fact, if a competitor or somebody basically saying that, we are all set or we already have something for this, if they're saying any of those type of things, your chances of success in terms of progressing the deal are actually higher. Big surprise, Jason?
Yeah, this is actually a really big surprise because a lot of the companies that we work with, sell software or some sort of professional service that is very common, like a marketing agency, for example. So most of the people that they're reaching out to are actually already like using a solution of some sort. And normally what happens is people get really disappointed. Oh, so-and-so's using my competitor, so-and-so's doing this. And it's like kind of demoralizing for them. And what I've always, kind of said was, well, that's a good thing because like that means you're reaching out to the right people. If they're already using like a solution like yours, you are reaching out to the right people. But I didn't know like how that would, and we can talk about how to handle this objection too. But like I didn't know that was actually a good thing. That if you can get the person to talk about something that they're already using, a competing solution, that actually creates a bigger need, I think, to have a conversation with you because they're being a little bit more open hopefully if you handle the objection correctly, they're being a little more open about what they might like or dislike, about that. And most people, I don't know what the stats are around this. I'm going to not even guess what it is, but I would say a lot of people, when I listen to the calls, like they aren't super excited about their current solution. It's just too much of a pain in the ass to switch.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely spot on. So, somebody mentioning that they're using something is a good sign for two reasons, right? One is they've identified the need already, right? And the second is that in some sense they've taken the first step towards being a little bit more open about the fact that they're sharing some information with you. I think what is important is to kind of handle that correctly. And what we'll see later is also data related to how mentions of competitors impacts overall win rates, right? So not just rates of cold calls moving forward. I think, like you said, right, people might mention that they are using something, and then it's important to be subtle about how you get them to kind of talk about their pains with the current solution, because that's always a very threatening discussion, especially because they know you're a competitor, and then they know that you're in a low trust position. Let's be honest, right? We've all seen those tables on marketing websites where it's like, this is our solution and this is the competitor, and it's all green checks, and then here it's all red crosses. So everybody kind of expects the person who's calling to say, oh, our product is the best or our service is the best. And I think that's kind of where the balance lies in winning trust. And I think a useful tactic there could be to even highlight, what you don't do well versus your competitor.
Yeah. So I love the transparency part of this. And just because people are going to want something actionable here, I could give you a quick framework for how to handle a competitor objection, because you should really lean in here. This is a good thing if someone is willing to share this information. And Tony here in the comments said, mention of competitors creates an opportunity to address prospects' wish list, increase the run rate, cost savings and service, et cetera. So what you need to do is it's not about the logical reason why they should use your solution over the other. It's really about disarming the prospect. And a way that you can do that is through a 3-part framework. It's empathize and then validate, and then you can go in for an ask for next steps. So the empathize part is you want to comment on what you think they're thinking, right? And you want to disarm them in doing that. And what you can do is, hey, sounds like you're taken care of. Or hey, sounds like you guys have put a lot of thought into fixing this problem or doing this thing. Sounds like you're taken care of. And the validate part is I'm going to let them know that that's okay, right? That they may not want to talk to another person. So I'm going to say, hey, sounds like you're taking care of Shruti. And I imagine you're probably wondering, why would I want to continue talking to Jason if we already have a solution in place? And if that's the case, I totally understand, right? So the goal there, disarm the person. The offer piece is where you could do something like, hey, would it be a bad idea? Or hey, would it hurt if I shared a little bit more? Or hey, would it hurt if I spent maybe a minute? I just have 2 questions just to make sure that you're getting the most out of this, this, and this, right? Or hey, do you have a minute or 2? I can ask a few questions. I'd really love to hear how you're solving this problem that I hear a lot of folks like you share with me. And you're going to ask for permission to really dig in and ask some questions. So you could disarm them, empathize, validate, let them know, hey, totally good. Sounds like you're taken care of. I've actually heard of them to do a really good job, but hey, would it be a bad idea if we asked, or if we spent a minute, I could ask you a couple questions related to this thing. And then you're almost asking for permission to pry just a little bit into what they like, what they don't like, whatever it might be. So that's a little, kind of tactical way that you might be able to step in and handle that objection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings us maybe to the next one, which is, related to your asking permission piece, right? So that's the other thing that we hear a lot, right? Asking permission for saying, hey, could I take 30 seconds or 27 seconds of your time? And, those type of opt-ers, especially for cold calls. And so we wanted to see whether those things actually work, because, I think there are enough people who talk about how pattern interrupt is good, right? And then people who say that having something to, that is scripted to start off your cold call helps you at least come across as confident, and, you're less likely to put down the phone just because somebody picked up the phone, right? So I think we wanted to maybe look at that battle when we looked at this. Here is the data. So in fact, asking for that upfront contract, and to be clear, upfront contract here, especially those type of permissions that people ask at the start of a cold call, like, do you have a minute? Can I have a minute of your time? Or, this will only take 30 seconds or whatever. All right, so we're looking at that kind of information here. And what we see is that it does actually help in progress rates, which means that, yeah, I mean, it gives you that extra a little bit of time to just collect your thoughts and maybe get you going. It maybe is a little bit non-threatening for people to say, that this is not going to go into a 15-minute call and just be a time sink for me, right? So looks like that helps.
Yeah, so because people are asking what's upfront. So this is, if you haven't heard of this technique or you don't use it, and this data didn't surprise me actually, because this is like anecdotally, I see this working, but it's like, hey, Shruti, Jason with Blissful Prospecting. Hey, I know I'm catching you in the middle of something here, but do you have 30 seconds? I could tell you why I'm calling. You can let me know if you want to keep chatting. So upfront contract, Sandler selling kind of popularized that concept, but there's all kinds of different variations of that opener that you can do. But it's like right at the top, I'm going to tell Shruti how long I need, and then I'm going to ask if she's cool if I take that time, and then you can decide if you want to keep chatting. So this is cool. And then Raj asked, does progress rate mean getting a follow-up meeting? Yes, that's moving the deal forward, like some sort of next step. A meeting is what that stat reflects. So setting a demo, some sort of intro call, qual call, fit call, whatever you call it.
Exactly. So the way we qualify the progress is like, before the call, the deal was at a particular stage, and today the deal is at a stage that is later than that, right? It's not gone back to disqualified. It's not gone back to nurture. It's not at the same stage as at which it was when the call happened.
Cool.
And I see Brooklyn also asked something about, how do you kind of spread these best practices across the whole team? I think there is a lot of repetition that needs to happen for people to change because, like I said, I think sales is a pretty high stress environment. I think having scripts, having a little bit more structure, having content cards or battle cards, all of those things help. And I think what is most important is to make sure that those things are, kind of showing up for your reps with enough frequency so that they are getting constantly reminded of those best practices.
Yep.
And I think the other thing related to the upfront contract piece and breaking the ice on a cold call is, mentioning that, hey, I sent you an email, did you get a chance to look at my email? Those type of things, right? Jason, what's your view here?
So this actually surprised me. I tell people not to mention the email that they sent, and then I hear a lot of people that like, oh, it makes me feel comfortable when I mention the email that I sent, and I won't spoil the surprise here, but this one surprised me actually quite a bit.
Yeah. So
no impact.
Yeah. I think whichever camp you belong to, you can continue doing that. This is not one that you need to change. But yeah, it's one of those things. Like I think some reps need a little bit more safety net than others. Maybe when you're early on and you're calling, it's harder. Looks like this is not a bad safety net to have.
Yeah. So if you need it to feel comfortable to mention it, like just do it. And if you don't mention it, you're not missing out on anything.
Yeah. Okay. So let's shall we jump into kind of the exciting best practices, which we wanted to challenge, and we'll hear what happens.
Yeah. Let's dig in. And it sounds like so far we kind of looked at some qualification questions, just the opportunity there. And by the way, in the Q&A part, you guys, you can upvote and put a thumbs up next to the stuff that you really want us to answer, because we're probably not going to be able to get to everything. But go ahead and upvote the stuff that you really want to hear about in there, so that we can get to it. I'm excited for this part.
Okay, perfect. Let's kind of do this as a rapid fire, so we have some time for Q&A. So problem-based selling. So Jason recommended we look at, it's an important one. We wanted to see whether people are actually trying to build the rapport, ask, kind of connect with the customer where they are by leading with the problem instead of the solution. All right.
Yeah, I mean, this is like something that you hear preached a lot, and I think that there's also this like method of selling that I hear about that's like talk a lot about like what you do, and like every company we work with talks a lot about like the solution. It's a lot of like, here are all the features and how it's going to save you time and money. And they completely gloss over to like, how is this connected to a problem, that the person is having? So this is something I feel very, very strongly about.
And how often do you think this happens, Jason?
Ooh. I mean, this might be, I'm guessing it's, okay, 3.6% of the time. Wow. Okay. I thought I was going to say around 5 or 10% of the time, I think that people probably really dig into problems during the sales calls.
Yeah. Yeah. And, honestly, we're not even like, further bifurcating this to say how often are people really digging into it versus just mentioning that this is a problem or this is a challenge that we solve.
Yeah.
And I would say that this was really, really low in my opinion. And I think that, of course, like if you were to present this data to your reps, the other thing that you would want to present is how does this impact win rates, right? And these are not just rates on the deal moving forward, but this is actually rates of the deal closing, right? And so, stark increase. Honestly, if as a rep, I saw this data, I would be kicking myself for not leading more with problems.
And John asks, what's the other 96.4% doing? Well, I can just look at Shruti. How would you describe the last 10 demo calls that you've been on? What is the content of those demo calls?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. Like people are too hesitant to, like they feel that they don't want to be imposing on your time. And so they kind of want to jump straight into the solution.
Yeah.
Right. And that's kind of what they're doing. A lot of times, I think the excuse that people make to themselves is, listen, if the person showed up as an inbound lead, the chances are they already know what the problem is, right, or what problem we help solve. But I think that the framing really helps because that can help you, through that qualification and discovery process of making sure that, everybody's aligned and they know why they're on that call.
Yeah, my experience reflects the same exact thing. I can think of all the demos that I've been on actually in the last 3 or 4 years. Only one demo call ever have I participated in where the person actually asked me around like, how are you taking care of this right now? Like, what's the most frustrating part of doing it that way right now? Or how's that impacting your business? One time. Everyone else goes straight to like, they go through each of the features individually of the product or service that they're selling. Here are the 3 things. Here are the 3 reasons why people hire us or use our solution. There's like no connection at all. So the fact that it's so low is kind of surprising, but I thought it would definitely be around like 10% or lower.
Yeah. The good news seems to be that maybe people are picking up more on this. Again, this is, very point-based data. So we kind of need to see a longer trend. But maybe COVID has again sharpened our knives on this one. So the other thing that we hear is, always be closing, right? Which is trying to move things towards a commitment, towards a very concrete, contract, POC, those type of things. And so we wanted to see what that language translates into. So clearly reps are much more prone to doing this than they were to talking about problems and challenges that they solve. Any surprises there?
Yeah, I'm surprised this one is isn't higher. This is like it's such old school advice, but it's still something I hear a lot of sales leadership, like, dude, always be closing, always ask for the sale, always ask for the next appointment, like always ask, like make constant asks. Yeah, I mean, this one's definitely higher. I'm surprised it's not higher than 21%.
So actually, this doesn't include people just asking for a next step, and we'll see the data on that
Oh,
in a
okay.
minute.
So this is just
all your
purely
outbound
closing and
calls.
asking. Okay,
Yeah,
gotcha.
asking for contract, like,
Yeah,
can I send you a, DocuSign contract, those type of language.
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah, and I guess this is maybe not as surprising, right? Like where you see those things being mentioned, also in some sense already means that, the conversations are a little bit more advanced, right?
Mhm.
And so you definitely see a higher win rate here. I think one thing in general to be aware of when you're looking at any data is, you know, correlation versus causation, right?
Yeah,
So just because this is happening, you can't say that this is the reason for why. And of course, we can make that argument for any of the data points that we look at. But I think especially for this one, it's kind of a little bit trickier. Um, I think the other thing that reps need to remember from here is while the win rates are higher, the win rates, and again, just to give everyone a reference point, right? The baseline win rate for all deals that you're seeing here is around 6%, 5.5 to 6%. And so, even in the case where people are talking about closing signals, the win rates are, of course, still in the kind of 10% ballpark. So it still doesn't mean that just because you spoke about a contract, your deal is going to go through.
yeah, yeah. And just to give other people some clarification as well, because Brandon's asking about like the types of sales calls. Is this kind of a mix of people selling stuff that's transactional versus enterprise? Like, is there kind of everything mixed into this?
It is everything mixed into it. I would say that just in terms of volumes, it's dominated by, like the $1,000, like, somewhere between the 20 to $80,000 kind of range of deals,
Yeah,
right?
those are good sized
So
deals. I
nothing
don't.
for enterprise.
Yeah, I don't consider that transactional. Um, Transactional
Not
to me is
transactional.
stuff that's like, $10,000, $10 to $20,000 or less. Stuff that you don't need like very much signing from your prospect. You don't need too many people to sign off on it. So yeah, it's a mix. Okay, cool.
Yeah, so the other one that I am very fond of is customer stories. I think it's super important if people can tell a good story. It helps with many things. One is, of course, using that as a way to build trust, but I think also using that as a way to highlight the problem that the tool solves, all right, in a more kind of non-salesy friendly manner. Um, and what is disappointing but not surprising, at least in my mind, is that this happens in very, very, very few calls.
Yeah, that's crazy.
um, if I were to take a guess why this happens so less is because I think very often the reps, like some of the deals that you want the reps to talk about are not necessarily the deals that they have closed, right? So their ability to kind of weave that into a story is limited. What do you think, Jason? Any reasons you can think of why reps don't do this more often?
I think that they're really uncomfortable with it because most of them, like you talked about, I think they don't have a framework to tell the story with, and I think they also like are thinking about like how specific this needs to be to the prospect, and it's like really familiarizing yourself with like I think really low hanging fruit opportunity for you is if you haven't checked out and like really read in depth every one of your company's case studies, like you should have 1 to 2 customers in mind, even if they're not ones that you personally closed or set appointments for, that you can reference at any given time. So I think like having the information available is one part of it, and then having a framework that you feel comfortable. Like no one is really teaching, from what I experience in the companies I work with, like how do I tell a story? How do I tell that customer story in 30 seconds, 60 seconds? Versus, yeah, so we worked with this company. It was really awesome. They had this problem. We fixed it for them. It's super cool. Like it needs to be more in depth and like more like, how do you connect that back to like the prospect that you're talking to. So I think it's a skill thing in my experience.
Absolutely. And I think as maybe managers think about their SKOs this year, maybe that's something that they should pay attention to. Maybe it's a good opportunity to bring your customers to get them to tell their own stories.
Yep.
Yeah, and not a surprise here. It definitely helps improve win rates. I think this actually, is important, especially even more so for services businesses where, the customer story is really your biggest way to build trust and make yourself stand out.
Yep. And this data too, because some people are asking, this is across, I know, North America, and then what other like countries and stuff do you guys have your customers in? Just so people can get an idea of like where the data is kind of collected.
Yes, I would say it's like 85% or so North America, right? And then maybe the rest of it is split across half Europe and half, Asia Pacific, more like Southeast Asia and India. But
Gotcha.
literally like majority and overwhelming majority is just North America.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, so I think this was the other one that you were mentioning, Jason. Do people, do reps set up next steps? And like, I think everybody goads them to. And so I think this one would be a nice surprise. And so just to set context, right, like here we are looking at calls that are a little bit longer, right? So these are typically, you would assume late stage calls, like 15, 20 minutes or more. And so what we see here is that, in 90% of the cases, people are setting up next steps, or at least the reps are asking for next steps, right? They're having that conversation. And it doesn't seem to impact win rates, right? I think that's largely because it's happening pretty much in every call anyways, right? So, the baseline isn't very different. So yeah, I think managers can relax on that a little bit. I think reps have gotten that message right.
Yeah. What does the next slide say? Yeah, I think this is the really important part here is like it. So what you're saying, Shruti, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that talking about next steps, we're not saying that that's not important to do. What we're saying is that like your focus, like, because there's so much of it on like secure next steps, like the other stuff that you should actually be thinking about that has a higher correlation with the closing rate is those qualification, areas. Like, is there a clear need here? Like, is there a timeline that there, like, is there urgency? Are you talking to the right people? Like, have you had the budget conversation yet? Like, those are actually higher indicators of close rates and win rates than just next steps. And people are like 91% of people are already doing a good job of next steps anyways. So like, don't focus. Don't make that the entirety of the focus, I think is kind of the takeaway here, if I'm understanding correctly. Yeah,
exactly. And I think as a manager, like the takeaway broadly overall is to say, listen, can I pick one theme that I want my team to improve on, maybe this month? And because it's really hard for people to kind of change 5 things at the same time, right? And so it's important to kind of pick what those 3 things are for this quarter, and then have a right sequence to it. And next steps wouldn't make that cut for sure.
Yeah, awesome.
Jason, I know we're kind of running out of time. Do you want me to maybe skip through some of the stuff, or should we just do this really quickly?
Let's go through pricing and then let's get to some questions. Yeah, I think the pricing one is pretty cool.
Okay. So yeah, one is this happens really, really often in calls. And I think very often I hear managers telling their reps that, hey, I don't want you to discuss pricing. I want you to leave this to the AE or to a later stage, or you need to have done A, B, and C before you are okay to talk about pricing. And honestly, the thing is, none of us would buy things without knowing a reference price. Like, I understand in some cases it's hard to tell a direct price. And so, I think it's important for organizations to figure out how they want their reps to handle pricing, even if they don't want them to reveal it very early on. I absolutely hate it, and I've heard this in so many calls, people saying, sorry, I'm not authorized to talk about pricing. which I think is just not the response that
Yeah.
a prospect would want to hear.
Yeah, definitely not. I can share that with you. You're going to have to wait until next week when you can meet with my AE. In the meantime, I'm going to go to your competitors, and if they're easier to work with, and I can get the pricing I need, I might be more likely to just go with them instead.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think that was the verdict on pricing. I'll skip through the competitors bit, but and I can skip through this as well. But I think there was one that we wanted to talk about,
Yeah,
which was
definitely this one. Yep.
the talk to listen ratio. So, I think everybody is being told, you have one mouth and 2 ears, and so listen more and talk less. I think broadly that sounds sensible. So we looked at the data, and what we did was we categorized calls into, things where the rep spoke for less than 50% of the time, things where the rep spoke for between 50 to 65% of the time, and then calls where the rep spoke for more than 65% of the time. And we found a big fat 0 as a difference in terms of win rates. So that was actually pretty shocking to me myself, because I think we all have been led to believe so much that this has a big impact. And of course, I would take this data with a large pinch of salt, because a couple of reasons, right? One is different sales processes have different requirements. If you have a really complex product, you need to maybe talk and make sure that your prospect understands what it does, right? I think that there are, again, like certain exceptions to the talk less, listen more rule. But yeah, overall, the data is what it is.
Yeah, this one was a huge surprise to me, because I think that a lot of people when they're coaching, including me, would look at talk to listen ratio as a leading indicator for something. And it's actually you see a really interesting range where sometimes you have reps with high closing rates that do a lot of talking. They might talk 70% of the call, but they're really good at asking questions and digging into the things and talking about what the prospect wants to hear about, and then you get people that don't talk very much at all. And that, so I fit in that category. That was an interesting, because I use Wingman. I talk about 30% of the time through the sales process. And I was freaking out, because I'm like, should I be talking more? Because what I hear is that it should be split, or maybe I should be talking, I didn't really know what the baseline should be. And this is pretty comforting, knowing that hey, dude, with very rare exception, you don't really need to pay close attention to this. It's more again, coming back to, budget, authority, need, timeline, and the big one being need. Is there a problem here that they feel is worth fixing? And do you have a conversation about that? And don't worry so much about how much they're talking versus how much you're talking.
Yeah. And yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Not everything that is being said, and I think Raj said this, not all words carry equal weight. And I think that's exactly what happens, which is, some people, and you made a great point, some people are really good at anticipating the customer's needs, and therefore they're really good at saying the right thing. But I think maybe if you're starting out and, unless you're selling something that's super complex, maybe it is a good practice to make sure that you leave some bandwidth and space for doing the discovery and asking the questions. Because I've also seen reps go completely in the other direction, right? And not be responsive to whether or not the other party is even interested in listening, right? And they just ramble on.
Yeah. Great. Before we get to some of these questions, I want to share something, where can people go to learn more about Wingman? And then I want to share, we got a Black Friday deal I wanted to share with everyone as well. But where's the best place if someone's thinking all of this sounds really good, Shruti? How could I capture some of this data for my team specifically, or even for myself? Can you tell us a little bit more about what Wingman does and where people can go to check that out?
Sure. So Wingman, plugs into different types of conversations across dialers, video calls like this one, and takes the data, transcribes it, and then makes sense out of it, and also then correlates that with your outcomes from your CRM data. You can of course learn more about us on the website, www.trywingman.com. Maybe I'll just put the link.
I got a short link actually. I'll throw into the chat there.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
And yeah, and the other thing that I really want to make sure is when I started this out, I wanted to make sure that this is a tool that's a wingman for salespeople. So we also do a lot of things that help and support salespeople while they are in the call. So they can get prompts and their personalized cues. So if you say a lot of does that make sense and you want to get over that habit, it's going to like knock that into you right there as you make that mistake. So yeah, there's also a lot of cool stuff that we do in real time.
Yeah, I definitely recommend checking out. I mean, it was so cool, like during my discovery calls, and I don't do a demo necessarily where I talk about a product, but I kind of demo and walk through our coaching programs. And it was kind of cool because I get little cues if I was talking too much, or I get little cues if the prospect brought up a specific talking point around my competitors, let's say, and it would give me some talking points that I have. But I want to share this with you guys too. So if you go to that link, blissfulprospecting.com/wingman, I put it in the chat. There's actually a Black Friday deal. If you're interested, if you use the coupon code JBay, you get 50% off your first 6 months. And it's super affordable, especially for individuals. So I would definitely check it out. Shruti, this has been awesome. We got a couple more minutes here. I figured I want to get this in before people have to take off for their meetings, but we got probably time for a question or two. And it looks like the question Tom Laker asks is the most upvoted. What is the nicest way to ask about their budgets? I'll let you go first on this, Shruti, and I have some thoughts on it, but budgets. We need to ask about it. What's a good way to ask?
Yeah, I think one way to ask about the budget is to actually help quantify the extent of the problem, right? And basically to kind of say, okay, what is the size and magnitude of the problem? Like how much money are you losing on this, or how much time, and how does that kind of relate to in terms of money, and get them to kind of talk that through, right? But the other part of the budget is, of course, are they, the reason why they're dissatisfied with their status quo, right? And that I think often becomes their benchmark for the budget, and so to kind of understand what the status quo looks like. But I think if you want to directly ask about budget, I think the preemptive approach that you suggested was good, and I would let you take that.
Yeah, if you could kind of let them know, like, because you feel awkward asking for it, you could just say something kind of along those lines, like, hey, I know it might feel like I'm kind of prying, but the reason I'm asking is that like a lot of people kind of come into these calls like with a budget in mind of like what they're looking to spend, and you may or may not have that ready, but I was curious, but did you have something like specific in mind budget wise? Like that's a really like easy, simple way that you can ask it. You're giving them the reason why you're asking it, and you're kind of removing the weirdness, from asking that question. You can literally do that with any part of like, if you're using Bant, or some people use MedPick or Medic or whatever other, methodology you're using. If you could kind of preempt the qualification questions with like a reason why you're asking it, and let people know that like, hey, a lot of times people do come in with that stuff. It makes asking the question like way easier. Hopefully that helps you, Tom. Great question. I think we got time here for one more. So Shane Martin asks, what are the top 3 qualification questions to ask if you're selling professional services? Well, I mean, we gave you one of them there with budget. Is there any insight you have around like maybe authority? Like we could do the authority one next. And we did kind of talk about this a little bit earlier, but anything that you can share there, Shruti, that you see with like your guys' customers and how they sort of ask the authority questions and poke and prod in that area?
Yes, I think one way people ask is, hey, is there anyone else that needs to be involved, or would you like to invite someone to our next meeting? Right. And I think that kind of gives them an easy way to kind of get more people involved. The other way people sometimes ask that softly is by just saying, I'm going to send you this information at the end of the meeting. Is there someone else from your team that you'd like me to copy on that, right? Like, so that's kind of some of the softer approaches. Honestly, I've also seen people, straight up ask the question of saying, hey, what does your, what does your purchase process look like? Or, if you've bought this tool in the past, or, something similar in the past, then how, how did that approval process go? And I think that's pretty typical to ask if you're doing an enterprise deal. It's not And I think generally, if you're doing a larger deal, I think people expect those questions. But yeah, they can come across a bit prying if you're asking them early on. And I think it's also important to do some research to make sure that you're not asking an authority question to somebody who clearly has the authority. Like if you're speaking to the CEO, you don't need to ask them do you have the authority to make the decision?
Yeah, I think you mentioned a really good point there is if you can kind of come in to the discovery call and you've already kind of done research on the company, so you kind of know who would probably be involved. You can also be a little more specific and say, hey, I noticed that so-and-so also works with you on the marketing team. Is this problem affecting them as well? Or how do you think that this problem is affecting them? Or what do you think that they would have to say about, this problem? Or what are their thoughts on this kind of thing? So if you can really use the need aspect as a way to kind of drive the conversation around the authority. Another really simple question, you kind of alluded to this too, is just, hey, can you tell me a little bit more about your team? Who else do you work with on this? And it's you're just kind of getting an idea of who they work with, who else might be involved, et cetera. That's all we got time for, you guys. I'll send this recording out to everyone afterwards so that we have it. But Shruti, thank you for spending time with us today. This was awesome. There was a lot of stuff today that I learned, and I already kind of poked through a little bit of the data, but there was a few surprises in there that were super cool. And I appreciate you gathering all that information and sharing it with us.
No, this was great. And thanks for being such an interactive audience. I love this.
Cool. Awesome. Yeah. Thank you for the participation, everyone. And we'll talk to you later. Have a good rest of your week. We'll see you.
Looks like a lot of people want to gift you a poster, Jason.
Yeah. And respond to my email that I send out after this. All right. Later, Shruti.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.